Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, continuing on with Trope Talks. This time, their planet, Red's Planet of Hats. Now, this is a trope where essentially you give a broad generalization for a culture, because it makes it's so much simpler than just giving, actually making diving in and really giving them a more in-depth culture. And also by doing that, like, let's say you you have you have a culture where they kind of look like they're from the east and they love horses and they're archers, horseback archers. Every single child rides a horse and learns to shoot a bow from atop of horseback. Immediately in the reader's mind, that culture to them has a lot more depth because they immediately, as long as they know who the culture is supposed to be and they know a little bit about it, immediately in their mind they're like Mongols. And they can then, if they know a little bit about the Mongols, they can make further assumptions about that culture within your world by just because you gave them a slight comparison to a real world, because you gave them one thing that makes them similar to a real world culture. Or and of course, very generalizing is dangerous territory because it does get into stereotyping, which of course can be problematic. But before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love you to join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. Um, it's it happens with Vikings. It happens with a lot of cultures. However, I think this generally happens to uh, non-white cultures, to say the least. Because typically through fantasy books, you are then reading a story through the POV of a white character, and so it is the white character's culture that gets explored and is given depth. But then the other cultures outside of it are not really. They've been given the Planet of Hats trope, which is where it does get problematic. And I'm curious how Red is going to tackle that, or if she's even going to mention the slight problematicness that could be attributed to Planet of Hats. How you get around that, it's hard really to get around that because, of course, if you then spend the time to give each of these cultures the same amount of depth as your main POV character, your story is never going to be written. So it is hard to maneuver around, in my opinion. And so it comes down to being a bit clever in the way you provide information on cultures. You've got to ultimately. I try to I avoid the Planet of Hats trope because of the issue it can have from stereotyping, and also I I don't want to say I completely avoid it because certainly it is impossible to completely avoid it, and it does make things easier if you do put those kind of like paint a picture where someone can then think of a real world equivalent, and it allows them to get more depth on the culture. So it really also depends on what exactly kind of blanket statement you are going to be giving to that culture that you're representing in your book. So it's really iffy, but I try to either typically what I do is I then just make them cool characters. You make them in-depth characters. For one, you don't like. I think it comes down to if you are going to be giving them a one note, if you as the writer are giving them kind of a 2D character because maybe they don't serve too much of a purpose to the story, or they're maybe just there to help move plot along, and they're ultimately not within the story for very long, then they should belong to one of the cultures that you have written about in depth. And then if you have a character from a different culture that is going to be explored in in detail, then they should be a three-dimensional character, while then the culture that they belong to is maybe a bit more one note, right? I think it would be problematic if you were to have it be, you know, him be a flat character, because also I want to state flat characters are not bad. They have their use. Um, they can also be very entertaining as well. So again, it just depends on how you use them within your writing. Um, so it's like, in my opinion, it's like if your character's 2D, make them belong to one of the cultures that you have really fleshed out, so that the audience is able to then draw more ideas of who, like it'll help give, in my head, it'll help give the reader an illusion of depth, right? If it's a 2D character but they belong to a culture that the reader knows pretty well within your world, that immediately gives that 2D character more depth, because you've experienced other characters from that culture that maybe are more fleshed out, and now you're like, oh, maybe this character is like that one or that one. But then if you have a three-dimensional character and a culture that is flat and 2D and Planet of Hatsy, you then have a character that might give more depth to the 2D culture, because it's like, oh, this guy that we've met, that we know very well, we know his inner thoughts, maybe his culture is kind of a bit like that. And that allows you to go multiple ways then if you want to further detail out that one note culture. Because it's like, oh, is this culture a lot like this guy? Does the values of this character are their values representative of the average of the culture, or is he an anomaly? It helps lead you and the reader to making assumptions, to getting at visualizing the culture a bit better. No fucking clue if any of that was at all related to this video, but it was a tangent that came into my brain and I wanted to explain myself. 7 minutes, and we are now starting the video.
Especially fantasy and sci-fi, love making up cultures with one notable characteristic. You got your warrior race, and your pacifist race, and your people who ride horses a lot race, and your everyone wears a funny hat race, and your hippie druid race, and my god, they're everywhere. Planet of the Hats is the TV...
And I typically avoid this, actually, if we're going off this blanket statement. I have, what I like to do, actually, is maybe have, kind of, my stories have a lot of the notion of picking apart propaganda, and I do try, at least if I'm writing it right, if I'm writing it properly, when things get revealed or more information becomes available, it's like, oh, I was being purposely misled by the author because he was being smart. He was using, like, propaganda is fun to play with. Think Palpatine Star Wars prequel trilogy. People that believe Palpatine, like real life people, believe Palpatine's manipulations, believe Palpatine's propaganda and Imperial propaganda, because the writers for Star Wars, at least in that aspect, like the Star Wars writers George Lucas has made mistakes with a lot of his writing, but one thing I think you can say for certain that he did not really make a mistake on was the propaganda that Palpatine uses, because it is effective and it works on real life people, despite it being a story with laser swords and magic, with space samurai. That's good writing. Hopefully I can do that. But, like, I've got a culture that I've kind of blended the Bedouin people of North Africa and the Mali Empire. I've got a culture that I've got an area of the world that kind of is essentially Native American tribes, and they're not entirely they're not as fleshed out as, say, the Bedouin inspired people yet. I'm working on it. I'm slowly working on it. But of course, if I were to spend time to build them out, then the story's never going to get written. But yeah, hopefully I'm avoiding wrong trope, but awful tropes. But and then I've got, I'm taking. I've got elves that are inspired from different real world cultures. We've got Chinese inspiration. We've got Southeast Asian inspiration. Blah 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 blah. And so I try to avoid the Planet of Hats, or at least I try to. I give a here's a typical thing that this part of the world might be known for, and then when you meet a character from that world, or maybe I try and then give like a secondary note where it kind of gives the illusion of there's more here, and so that the reader then thinks that I have the culture fully fleshed out, but really I don't. It's all about building illusion, baby. It's all about building illusion.
Trope name for a culture that has one specific hat, basically one notable trait that defines every single
I've been
member
rambling
of that
too
culture.
much
If
already.
you can think of a wacky character gimmick, there's probably a fantasy race that has that as their thing. Even the most basic building block fantasy races have a thing. Elves are generally nature-loving hippie archers, except for their cousins, the asshole elves, who are always pretentious with massive superiority complexes. Dwarves are all miners and craftsmen. Orcs are big, beefy tribal.
And don't forget, dwarves are always drunks as well, and Scottish.
Warriors. This kind of thing shows up everywhere. It's not always a single.
And so I wonder if she's going to dive into there is a problematic origin for orcs in terms of, they are, because of the warrior culture, they were, I believe, originally inspired from Africa, because of racist 1900s human thinking, white to man thinking. And so it's orcs typically, like, it's weird. It's weird how this thing has developed, where it's like these have really problematic origins, but they've become so ingrained within our fantasy, where now it's like it would feel weird to like really change them outside of the aesthetic that has already been established for several decades, right? However, what it seems to be is that people are making orcs more intelligent. Well, there are smart. That's one way to like get around it. Whatever. It's like just have your orcs be smart as well. Don't have your orcs be the warrior race or whatever, or have them be good warriors, but also give them a side of nuance. Give them nuance.
Character trait being applied to an entire species or civilization. Sometimes the writer might take an existing or historical civilization, crank it up to 11, and slap it on their story as a Planet of the Hats, where the hat in question is a heavily stereotyped existing or historical culture. Most classic fantasy worlds, at least the
As I was saying,
non-Tolkien-y ones, have at least one basically Roman Empire, boiled down to its fundamental stereotypes of gladiatorial arenas, decadent empires, and enormous armies of skirted manly men. Also frequently present are the basically Mongols, boiled down to the bottom line of scary horse-riding archers, and if your world had a lost ancient empire, it's probably going to be a hybridization of every pyramid-building society on Earth.
I don't have a pyramid building empire. Aha.
And basically every classic fantasy story like the Belgarian.
Do I have a Roman Empire? Well, no, I do. Well, I did take inspiration from the Roman roadways, the roads that that go throughout all of Europe. But then I also took inspiration from Alfred the Great and his fortification system. That's a thing that's within the histories of my world, and don't really play all that important. Well, they play somewhat of an important role in the story that I'm currently writing. That's set 300 years-ish after the fall of the empire. But like, anyway.
Ariad has a caliphate-ish trading empire, sometimes loosely based on the Great Zimbabwe Kilwa-Kiswahili Middle East China trade circuit that mostly dealt in gold and spices. And unsurprisingly, its primary trait when
I'm realizing here already that I may have avoided a trope. Or, well, I'm not doing the what is typically done with these with this trope. I'm unique.
Boiled down for literary digestibility is exotic, unfamiliar, and dangerous, plus some decadence and misogyny on the side. Oh, and keep your eye out for Fantasy Asia, which will have the rigid caste system and social structure of Vedic period India, the honor code of a highly fictionalized form of Bushido, and the opiate addiction of 19th century China. But
I might have Bushido. That's because I really love samurai, and I don't know, I really like that honor code. I like I mean, it's always cool having those super cool, super honorable warriors. They're fun. They're a good time. They're fun to write. Okay, leave me alone. But I avoided the caste system of India, and I have avoided the opiate addicted China. I'm doing good. I'm proud of myself. Go me. Go white author for doing the bare minimum.
The bottom line is
Man, I'm funny.
basically, if you have a planet of the hats, for the most part, it'll either be a highly stereotyped and homogenized version of a real society or group of societies, or a simplified civilization where every member of the society is basically a copy-pasted variant of a single character archetype. The hat can be more or less complex. If it's a boiled-down human civilization, it's likely to be a touch more complicated than a simple characteristic, but regardless, your planet of the hats is basically going
Essentially, what I was saying here is like, by giving the hat of a real world stereotype or a real world equivalent that is easy to pick out and see, it allows for the culture to immediately have a bit more natural complexity to it that you don't have to write out for the reader. The reader is able to assume the complexity by just having that one little thing that they are able to think of from their real world knowledge.
to be defined by a cultural personality rather than just having one. And that can be a hard distinction to make when you write.
Like I think if we look at it from I think Tolkien gives us a pretty good example of this. We get quite a bit actually through Aragorn and through the elves. We get a lot on elvish society culture. We get a lot on hobbit culture. We get through Gimli dwarvish culture, and then through and then we also get some of Gondorian culture. And those are rather in depth. However, when looking at the Rohirrim, immediately it's like they have a hat. Feels a bit wrong. They are horse riding Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons didn't really ride horses, and so that was a difference that Tolkien gave them. But aside from the horses, the way their culture is, their society, the language they speak, it's Anglo-Saxon. And then I'm reading the Unfinished Tales right now, and one of the stories is the Narn-hi Hurin. I can't remember the full name, but essentially the tales of the children of Hurin, and that through that has Turin Turambar, a bit of his story, and his battle with the great worm or whatever the fuck it is. I can't remember, the Glaurung, or was Glaurung the name of his sword? I can't remember. I already forgot. But you read that, and if you know a little bit about the Anglo-Saxons, you're like, this is the Anglo-Saxon culture, and he doesn't really give more depth to Turin's culture, to the sons of Hurin, those people, or the Rohan, because he's just giving them the Anglo-Saxon treatment, and so you are able to make the assumption that more in depth on what their culture is.
I mean, the fact is, while people are individuals, any sufficiently large group of people
I
will
hope
have
that
a
made
cultural
sense.
personality in the sense that they'll have recognizable characteristics. The Mongols did ride horses. The Romans did have a bit of a decadence problem. The practice of polygamy was very common throughout West Africa and the Middle East during the time of the major trade empires, and China did have an opium problem for a while. Stuff happens. Patterns exist. But in real life, patterns arise from circumstance, and in stories, we often
Exactly, and this, I feel like, comes from, and again, this is actually what Tolkien avoids with the trope, with the Anglo-Saxons within his world. It becomes very clear as you're reading, though, that the culture that they have is due to the circumstances of the way that they live, the area, the part of the world that they live, and what they have experienced in their world. Right? We understand why the Rohan are the way they are. They live in an area that is very much plains. They have a lot of plains. So of course they're going to be like horse riders. That's how you get across plains. It makes sense. open regions like that lend them, like, hence why horses, although there is an argument that horses are actually native to North America, and then when there was that ice bridge, the land bridge connecting America to Asia, horses went up there, and then horses died out in North America for some strange reason, but they continued to thrive in Asia and Europe, whatever. And then when horses were reintroduced, if we believe that theory, when horses were reintroduced to the Americas, horses took very naturally to the American steppes. Again, horses like open plains. So Rohan having horses makes sense. And I think why this trope can be problematic is because you have then people that do this trope but may not be, it's going to sound a bit pretentious, but essentially a student of history. If you understand your history, it becomes more inherently easy to avoid this trope because you understand, after studying history, you understand how patterns arise, right? Patterns exist. You understand them within cultures, that certain cultures do have patterns within them, but they don't just exist out of nowhere. You understand why they develop. So, like, let's say you take polygamy, you take inspiration from polygamy from West Africa or whatever. Through that, you expand upon it. You're like, all right, why does this culture practice polygamy? Is it through their religion? Is it maybe they have a lot of war, and so men go off to fight a lot, and so women stay behind. And then because so many men, because they have to, either the war is because of their own choosing or they have to constantly fight against an invader, they have then less men within their society. So then the men that are around, maybe when there are lulls in the fighting, they have men go and marry multiple women so that there can be more babies who reinforce the grow more warriors, grow more farmers, and have more women in the future to make more babies. And then because of their circumstance that they find themselves within, that culture finds themselves within, because they have to fight so many wars and so many men go and die in battle, it makes sense why they have polygamy, and in that way it doesn't become problematic for you to write that this society that is very clearly inspired from West Africa isn't being stereotypical, but instead is being built upon the realities of the world that you invented. Now, of course, I am a white man saying this, so it'd be better to hear from African writers or people from Africa, that African historians and the like, there, hear from them about how to avoid being problematic when it comes to taking inspiration from African culture and African history. And of course, that speaks broadly to all cultures of the world, cultures that have typically, historically, been underrepresented, and even misrepresented.
Work backwards, constructing those circumstances from the past.
I did not think I would have so much to talk about when it came to this trope. I thought this trope would be something I really couldn't talk much about, but apparently I really fucking can, because it is tied both to real world history, which I got a degree in history, and it's also fantasy writing. So this is a trope I can fucking talk about.
Pattern we want to evoke instead.
Damn.
The real world has
We're
stereotypes.
2 minutes into
In
the video,
fiction, we run the risk of making a world
and I've been
out
talking
of
for 24
stereotypes.
minutes.
For a simple example, let's look at fantasy dwarves. Thanks in large part to Tolkien, dwarves are generally short and stocky miners, smiths, and warriors all rolled into one. Now, Tolkien dwarves, and by extension modern fantasy dwarves, are based on Nordic dwarves, which were basically mountain spirits of wisdom, crafting, and mining that occasionally held long-standing grudges. They didn't have a fully developed culture in Nordic folklore because they weren't really people. They were intelligent, but they were spirits. They showed up to help forge stuff like Sif's golden hair or the unbreakable chains that bound Fenrir. But no world building went into the structure of the society of Svartalfheim because there wasn't one. They weren't a species, they were a plot point that showed up sometimes. So Tolkien took that mythology and turned it into the dwarves, a race of short, tough miners who had complex kingdoms and lived and ruled underground. They had the mining and the crafting down, and the wisdom, though kind of glossed over by the movie version, is very much present, and among other things, Gimli is one of the most poetic and articulate of the main characters in the main trilogy. The only main additions Tolkien made were their lineage of kings and their warrior culture, and as always, Tolkien went ham on the world building. For one thing, female dwarves were never really discussed in Nordic folklore. Sometimes dwarves' daughters would feature.
Okay, so she's not mentioning it right now. Tolkien also took major inspiration from Jews when it came to building the dwarves. You see this in The Hobbit. It has been stated many times that, and he even admitted that he took inspiration from Jews for when he crafted his dwarves. And we see that within, and dwarves are, yes, they aren't taken from Norse dwarves, but they are also have a very inherent Jewish coding to them. And you see that really in the way that dwarves tend to live within society and take part in wider society of the world. They typically are shunned from society, and one of the problems that Tolkien wrote, although he did not do it purposefully, and he even went back and corrected this after World War II, dwarves were greedy when he wrote The Hobbit. He gave them kind of I don't think he intended for them to all be interpreted as greedy, but of course, intention versus actual outcome tends to be different many times. So his intention was not to. They were essentially kind of bankers, right? They were miners. They had a lot of gold. They had a lot of wealth within them, in their mountains, and that, of course, is you could point to as being Jewish coded with the banking stereotype that a lot of Jews have, because, well, Christians couldn't run banks in medieval Europe, so the Jews ran the bank in medieval Europe, which then Christian rulers used to help spark anti-Semitism, and also it was a way for kings to get money quickly, because it's like, hey, the Jews run the banks, we're Christian, let's fuck them up. I'm gonna take their money. The money belongs to the state now. No, boy. It's more complicated than that. But Jews not treated well in Europe is historical fact. And of course, they lived within kind of isolated societies, kind of keeping to themselves because they did not feel welcome within wider society where they lived. And that is what the dwarves experience. But then after World War II, Tolkien actively worked on fixing that. And I think that's really why we have Gimli the way he is, because Tolkien really wanted to, like, hey, I did not mean to do this. I didn't mean to put in a negative stereotype. Because Tolkien was a lover of cultures. He was a man that loved the world. He loved all cultures of the world, pretty much, as far as I'm aware. He never really said anything racist. Although, of course, he was a white man living in the 1900s, a posh British man that taught at Oxford University, studier of Anglo-Saxon languages. So, of course, there are problematic things within his writing that I do not think he intended, though. So I give him benefit of the doubt there, that hopefully. But yeah, I don't, that. I forget where I was originally leading with this. Yeah, dwarves Jewish coded a bit. However, he didn't intend for that. He didn't intend for the negative stereotypes, or maybe he just didn't know them to be negative stereotypes. Again, because he was a Catholic man, so he wasn't really living within the Jewish society, so he didn't really know what was going on within them, or maybe the feelings that they had about certain things. Blah blah blah. And yeah, but after World War II. After Hitler, he was like, went in, fixed his shit, and he was like, this is dwarven culture. What you saw in The Hobbit was just like a subsect of the dwarves and not representative of the whole. Lord of the Rings trilogy gives a representation of the whole of Dwarven culture.
But there was generally some distinction made between them.
Don't
and
fucking
just
know if I made
dwarves.
any
But
sense.
obviously, if you're building a society of people that reproduce like people do, you need to consider the women. So Tolkien specified that there were female dwarves, but they were generally either totally indistinguishable from male dwarves and off doing warrior stuff, or they were spending most of their time in the mountains working as craftspeople. Tolkien moved on to handling the ever-present society-building food question by having the dwarves trade their crafts out to humans and elf societies in exchange for food rather than having to deal with farming. Though the dwarves were specified to be a race of hardy warrior badasses, they had a fully developed domestic society of all kinds of miners, craftsmen, masons, smiths, etc. Their hat is short, beardy fighter type, but there's way more to them as a society than that. And as a result, there's also more to their individuals than just short, beardy fighter type. Gimli is a proud princely warrior, but he's also capable of great awe and humility in the presence of Galadriel. Not to mention that whole besties with Legolas thing. The dwarves have a stereotype,
They were
but
roommates.
they aren't a stereotype. Tolkien built them to have a full society with distinct individual members, and thus avoided suffering from Planet of the Hat-itis. Similarly, and possibly
Although if you read The Hobbit, the dwarves kind of do have Planet of the Hat-itis.
to an even greater degree, Tolkien elves look like a Planet of the Hats, where their hat is that they're all gorgeous, elegant relics of a better time, ancient, wise, and more than a little alien. This is actually fairly common for elves in fantasy universes, not just because of Tolkien, but because it's easy to have an ancient, wise civilization of people who were just better, especially if you keep the survivors in reserve as a deus ex machina or something. Now in this case, the fact that this hat isn't a sufficiently detailed descriptor is obvious purely because of Legolas. Sure, he's gorgeous and elegant, but he's got very little of the relic of a better time thing going on. Legolas is more of the hippie, tree-loving D&D elf characterization, mostly because he's probably single-handedly responsible for that archetype. Most of the Tolkien elves just seem really tired, kind of aching to sail into the west in the Undying Lands. Legolas, on the other hand, even though he does end up sailing into the west in the end, is having a blast living in the forest and going on adventures and befriending dwarves. The fact that he's young by elf standards is certainly contributing, but the short of it is Tolkien's elves and dwarves look like they fit the feel of Planet of the Hats, but in point of fact,
Yeah, Legolas pretty much wasn't the story that like pretty much Legolas explored all he wanted to explore of Middle Earth, and then he was like, I'm gonna go west and I'm bringing my best buddy Gimli with me. Wasn't that pretty much it?
there's a ton of depth to both cultures, and the hat that best fits each species does not come close to fitting every member. Now this is unsurprising, because Tolkien was a world-building juggernaut who never did anything the easy way, but he was also an inspiration for basically the entire modern genre of fantasy, and let's just say his successors pulled the Planet of the Hats thing very regularly. Fantasy dwarves in general are what Tolkien dwarves look like at first glance.
Yeah, pretty much. And because of the way Tolkien in-depth built elves and dwarves, it has allowed modern writers now to give Planet of the Hats to dwarves and elves. Be like, yeah, because of what, if you read fantasy, you pretty much know Tolkien. And so, like, it's a near guarantee that if you read fantasy, you're also going to have read Tolkien or will read Tolkien. So because of him, people can now throw a hat on top of dwarves and elves. And because of your knowledge of Tolkien, elves, and dwarves, you're like, you have the assumption of that in-depth, complicated culture.
The stereotype is all they are. Fantasy elves, same thing. And for an example of the ripping cultural stereotypes from real life thing, the Belgariad, possibly the most standard fantasy land out there, has a whole mess of cultures of hats. All Drasnians are spies, all Cherriks are warriors, all Nissans are drug addicts with a penchant for poisoning people, and all Tolnedrans are merchants and traders. All of them.
Never heard of
There's
this.
a Drasnian protagonist, he's a spy. There's a Cherrik protagonist, he's a warrior. And not only that, he's a berserker that turns into a bear. It's very
Nice.
hatty, basically, and it's fun, of course, but it's more than a little jarring. Now, of course, the thing that makes this tricky is that, like I said earlier, in real life, patterns exist. People are individuals, but groups of people always have trends. Personally, I think we have a tendency to see too many patterns where some don't necessarily exist, and then spend more time trying to find a way to justify those patterns rather than checking to see if there's any founded reason to believe they're real, and that's how you get conspiracy theories, but that's neither here nor there. The point is,
Yeah,
because humans
that's
are
a lot
really
to
good at
unpack.
pattern recognition, we see large groups, especially groups we're not ourselves part of, as homogeneous units. And as a consequence of that,
Yeah.
usually when someone writes a culture of hats, that hat culture is specifically meant to be alien to the main character, and their home culture will have a lot more detail to it. And the cool part is, this
As I was saying in the beginning of the video,
can actually be a really good trick, because real people do see new cultures in terms of the big defining differences between their home culture and the new one. So showing us a fantasy or sci-fi culture in terms of the big differences between it and the familiar culture we presumably started in can be an incredibly useful tool to put us into the head of the main character, who is going to be looking at this alien culture with a buttload of preconceived notions and perceived homogeneity. But unfortunately, this only really works okay if the culture you write actually has more depth than just what the main character sees at first glance. You don't even have to elaborate it in story if you don't want to or it wouldn't fit. You just have to world build it behind the scenes.
illusion. And what she's kind of suggesting is, is maybe too much work. Don't world build it that much. I would say if you want to get your story written, you don't want to world build too much because then you're never going to get your story written, as I've said multiple times in this video. You want to world build it enough to where, I don't know, I think a good rule of thumb would maybe be 3 to 4 things tossed in there. 3 to 4 different things of the culture. You have let's go with one that would probably be pretty easily identifiable, because of this culture's how they dress. The Sikh people, in northern India, I think that's where the culture is. The Sikh people tend to wear turbans, and they also don't shave. As far as I'm aware, I've been doing some research. They don't shave their beards or cut their hair. That is part of their religion. And then they also wrap their hair in turban. So, boom, there's a plan of a hat. And you have a culture that is like the Sikh. They wear turbans and they don't cut their hair. And now, another thing that you can give them is you can give them the what the British thought of them, which of course does lend itself problematically. The British thought of the Sikh as one of the warrior cultures, as a warrior culture, and so that's why the British would actually use Sikh troops over certain other cultures that lived within India, because they viewed the Sikh as one of the warrior cultures. But from there, like, all right, so now you have maybe that homogenous view of them. They're a warrior culture from the outsider looking in. So now you have two contrasting. You have the real world thing that will make that culture identifiable to a real world equivalent, which gives them the inherent complexity. You have then that idea of a homogeneity, which will allow you to tear apart the homogeneity. Really, you want to give, what I like to see is cultures given a homogeneity, that assumption of homogeneous, and then have that thing pretty much get torn down, and them having like a different thing. And then, so now you've got maybe, all right, so this culture is known for its warrior. This culture, then you have their appearance, their typical appearance. They wear turbans. They don't shave their beards. They grow out their hair. Boom, now you have a bit of a typical appearance when it comes to them. Now give them a history. Give maybe a note of history. Maybe make it a side reference, like, oh, this historical figure from my people. Maybe have that character then tell that story. It doesn't have to be long. It can be a short one. It can be like of a battle, or maybe a siege, or maybe a ruler, and what they did for that person's people, what that ruler did positively, or maybe they were a tyrant, who knows, and then this culture rebelled against that tyrant. So now you've given the illusion of them having a complicated history, because you've assumed that they've had a tyrant in the past. So they've had a government before that wasn't tyrannical. Or maybe they've finally gotten rid of a tyranny. So you're building an illusion. You're giving the audience something you're leading them to questions for them to think about, and then through that connection that in their mind of the real world culture, they might be able to answer the questions themselves, or it could lead them to think like, oh, I see he took inspiration from here. Is this real world equivalent going to be the answer to that? And then you can like kind of, in a way, also end up subverting expectations if you want to take it a different route. I hope all of this makes sense. I feel like I'm rambling and not making sense at all.
To make sure it actually holds together. Because no culture...
And then a fourth one. An easy one to do is also food. Because, again, that gives real world equivalence. And food everyone loves food. That's an easy way. Um, I think another way is I kind of like to do geography. Give these people like this is the typical geography of this area, and then let people go from there maybe.
Sure is ever as cardboard cutout as it looks from
But essentially, at minimum, give them two things. I recommend so that you're not spending too much time world building. Because again, you want to write your story, you want to get your story written. Unless, of course, you have a secure job, you don't maybe want to be a writer as a career, and you just want to write a magnum opus by the end of your life, and you have no problem spending your years literally just world building as in depth as you can, and then before you die, releasing your fucking magnum opus of fully fleshed out cultures. You can go and do that. Me, I'm trying to be a writer as a career, so I can't spend the time world building in depth, even though I would very much like to. So 3 to 4, I think is a good number, a good balance of creating that illusion of an in-depth culture.
the outside. You'll always have subdivisions and subcultures and extremely localized social wackiness and internal social stereotypes.
Oh, a good fourth one is introduce another character from that culture that is different from the character that we're already familiar with. To again do what she's talking about here, subcultures.
Stereotyping and about a million other things that are what make a society feel real. And as a related side note, people tend to treat those first impression cardboard cutout patterns as a lot more important than they really are. Like, people in real life will make a big deal about actions or behaviors validating stereotypes, as though the actions of an individual are automatically demonstrative of their demographic collective. Patterns exist, but there's no need to go all, ooh, you really are all like that whenever the pattern manifests itself in an individual. People are individuals, correlation is not causation, etc., etc. Anyway, moving on. There are two major reasons a Planet of Hats actually shows up in any given story. Option 1, it's a backdrop for a section of the plot that's meant to be taking place in an unfamiliar land, or option 2, it's the origin location of one of the main characters. Sometimes it's both at once. In planet-hopping sci-fi shows, Planets of Hats usually happen about once an episode. Star Trek and Doctor Who are both absolutely full of them. They're usually there to provide a quirky location or premise for an episode, or, in rare occasions, are used for the very specific, one of your party members has committed a cultural faux pas they didn't know about and will be executed unless you do a thing, plotline. Option 2 is a little more varied, but it comes in 3 major flavors. In the first version, your character is exemplary of the culture, and everyone in their culture is basically them, or might even be less hat-wearing than the character in question. They probably left for a life of adventure because it's just what one does in their society, or they found themselves exiled, or they just decided to for funsies. Regardless, they're very likely to be welcomed back whenever they want to stop by for a visit. In the second version, your character is kinda lame or weird by the standards of their home culture, and whatever exemplary cool trait they have that defines their party role is something everyone has where they came from, usually more than they do. Your Viking analog might be 7 feet tall and super strong, but where he comes from, everyone is super strong, and the average height is actually 8.5 feet. This easily lends itself to the plotline where the character is embarrassed by how much better everyone back home is than they are at whatever their thing is, and they must receive external validation from their friends that they're still totally cool. And in the third variant, your character is explicitly rejecting their source culture. Very often this happens when their culture is an evil fantasy race like the Drow, but sometimes you just get a situation where the character doesn't fit in for whatever reason and runs away in order to make their own life rather than live one they wouldn't be happy with under the strictures of their home culture. Not only will this character not want to return home, they might not be able to under penalty of death or something. Needless to say, their home culture is liable to have some serious issues. Now, it's pretty clear why these 3 contexts lend themselves to being Planets of Hats so easily. Each one essentially creates a single character for the character's home culture that they either are, fail to live up to, or hate. More specifically, the culture only exists to contextualize the character, which basically means we'll only ever see it in the context of that character's actions. But that doesn't mean it has to be a Planet of Hats. The culture contextualizes the character, sure, but the culture is also more than just the character's specific plot trajectory. It doesn't have to be character, or character but better, or character but evil. It can also be, world built. It's pretty much impossible to make a Planet of Hats by properly world building, so as long as you flesh out the culture as a whole, you're pretty much guaranteed to avoid this particular pitfall. The Planet of the Hats' main problem is that it's boring. It takes what could be a complex, multivariate backdrop and flattens it into a matte painting with one specific characteristic. Rather than being a fully fledged culture, the Planet of Hats is basically a shortcut by which you can contextualize a character or an episode without having to put in too much work. It's serviceable, but it's kind of boring. So then, how do you world build a culture? Well, Well, okay, bear in mind that there's no single way to world build, and I'm not that good at it, so this is all kinda shaky? And you don't need to do it this way by any means.
How
It's
does
just
Red
what I
build?
do. So basically, here's my unofficial, highly simplified culture building
Let's
crash
see.
course. So I usually work from the ground up, joke totally intended, by starting with the terrain and then moving on to the weather, because those are going to determine
Oh,
the major
she
forces
tries
that
to do it super in depth. Oh man, how do I world build? I typically take a culture from our real world that I think is really cool, or I want to maybe even go and study more. That's my step one. So let's go with the culture I took. Let's go with the Bedouin people. That I got inspiration from because I was taking a pre-colonial African history class in my last semester of college over a year ago now. And through that, I remember reading when I was doing research for my final paper, which I only missed 1 point on. Wish I had gotten 100%. There was I was reading this. It was from this book from this Bedouin writer. It was a Bedouin historian, so a native. It wasn't some European writing on them, which I was very happy to find. It's hard to find actually native sources, native historian sources on Africa, or at least what I need. And it was a paper on, state building in North and West Africa. It was essentially a compare and contrast state building of North and West Africa, how they developed, blah blah blah. And through that, I remember reading something. It was like talking about how the Bedouin fought against their conquerors, right? Like the Romans and the Arabs. And I can't remember if this was how it was. It's been a while. But essentially, it was like the Bedouin would come from this culture would come from the Sahara. They would attack, and then they'd disappear into the sand. And that immediately gave me imagery for these kind of warriors I wanted to build that are a part of this society. So this society kind of started with the concept of these cool warriors that I wanted within it. And so then I was like, all right, what kind of history does this place have? What kind of system of government does this place have where these people are needed? And why are these warriors the way they are? Why are they reputed for like disappearing into the sands or whatever? Why is this part of their mythos? And so now there's a giant desert in the center of this country that exists for reasons that this video is going on long enough. I'm not going to share it here. I've talked about it on stream on my Twitch streams before when I was actually doing the map making for this country. But this was a few months ago. Those streams are no longer on Twitch because Twitch deletes streams after after 2 weeks now, and I can't keep them up permanently anymore. I talked about it, but yeah, they have that, and then it's like, all right, they have this. The country has these regions. The northern region is more fertile. Also, that's where the more successful ports are, because the water there, the bays are more easily accessible for ships, right? It's better for ships and trade up north. And then the western coast has more of a sheer drop off, so they can't really have ports, but they've got gold there. Those have gold fields, so they're wealthy over there. And then the south is kind of like has a lot of has a lot of riverways, and they have some culture there. They've got some things that separate them. They're not wealthy like the other two regions are. They're not wealthy in food. They're not wealthy in gold. They're more of a society that is forced to kind of they live within their, I can't remember the term. They don't produce enough to be profitable. They produce just enough for their population, that kind of thing. I remember the term. And then we have the east part of the land, where that's kind of very much mountains, kind of like called the Red Mountains. So there's iron there. They're even poorer than the South because they are very mountainous, so they are not very populated. They can't grow their own food. They have to kind of import food from the other parts of the kingdom, from the other regions, and so. But they have iron there, and they have some things that are historically happened over there. Blah blah blah. And I'm like, all right, what is the overarching government here, and how did that form to be? From there, I got the High Queen. Now, how is the High Queen chosen? Is it an elected position? How is it an elected position, or is it inherited? Are there people that want it to become an inherited position? That's just kind of the steps I take from world building. A lot of my world building actually comes from scenes that appear in my head. It's like, ooh, I want this scene to happen with kind of this inspiration from these two cultures. How do I get to this scene? All right. So here are the cultures that I want, that I kind of want to, that I like, that I want to maybe delve deeper into and do my own research. I learn more about them. Take inspiration from other cultures and mix them into this culture, give them my fantasy flair, that kind of thing. Because I don't like doing one-to-ones. I like to mix and blend, of course. That keeps it interesting in my head. So it's like, all right, I've got the scene. All right, now I've got these cultures. These cultures, how did they came to be? All right, like geography actually tends to be one of the last things I think about because I end up making the geography to service the culture I want to exist there. Right? I first start with what kind of culture lives here. Okay, now what kind of geography is necessary to help ensure that this culture makes sense for this region? And that's how I world build.
Shaped the
This
culture to
video
begin
is
with.
long.
If they're coastal or island-based, they're liable to be vulnerable to very large storms on very short notice. If they're mountainous or blocked by a desert, they're probably fairly isolated. If they live in or near a forest, they're potentially going to have fire problems. The terrain question segues into the next big consideration. What do they have to eat? Can they practice agriculture? Do they have the resources for livestock? Or maybe like Tolkien's dwarves, they just trade for all their food? If you want a big city, how does it sustain itself? Is there sufficient surrounding farmland to feed everyone? Or do they mostly do trade? Or do you want to handwave it with magic? Maybe you've built a city in and around an ancient colony ship and the old life support systems are handling your food question. But because usually everyone needs to eat, this is one of those questions that can make or break a civilization design. Also, what do they build out of? If your world has magic, maybe there's a market for stone-shaping wizards working in construction or growing houses out of living wood. If it's a desert, do they import or excavate stone, or do they maybe build with glass? Once I have the physical support structure figured out, I move on to the people. If you've got a much more distributed empire like Rome or the US or a colony planet-based galaxy-spanning empire, what's the internal variation like? Is the culture fairly homogeneous, or are there parts where it's very strongly one culture and parts where it's quite different? If you have a centralized empire with satellite towns, for example, how strongly is the presence and culture of the empire felt on the edges? In the galactic colony example, what kind of societies developed in the relative isolation of the very far-out planets? What professions are there a demand for? Is there some...
And then another thing when it comes, so like what I've said before is kind of like, yeah, this is the background history of the kingdom. And then when it comes to, like I said, I don't necessarily world build entirely in depth. I do have, well, hold on. This here is like 80 plus pages of handwritten notes front to back. And I'm not done. It's only there are timelines here for a family trees. We have typical names for this region. Again, this is a history for one group, and it only spans about 200 years so far. I handwrite because it helps. I find it relaxing, and I do my actual storytelling, the stories that I actually writing and wanting to publish. Those are that's written all on the computer. I don't handwrite those, but it's like I handwrite the history to kind of just give my eyes a break from the screen. I don't want to just do all of my writing on a screen. Got to vary it up. But so when it comes to a lot of cultures, I slowly do in-depth world building, but I do more of that illusion where it's like, okay, how to word this? Because it kind of makes it sound like I'm making it sound like my cultures aren't in depth, I consider all my cultures in depth. It's just like the story would not be good if I were to just detail out all the complexities of this country, of these people. And you don't need to even have those people all fleshed out in your mind. In fact, it is better not to have them fleshed out in your mind because you want to kind of be adaptable, right? You want to be able to change things maybe. And so I consider it better to just, as you're writing the story and the character comes across a person from this culture and maybe they have a conversation, have them talk about what brings them there. Like, have things only revealed that are related entirely to why that character is there. Because for one, if you do that, one, that's going to give more of an illusion to the whole idea that there's more there because the author isn't revealing everything. We just had one character reveal their life experience, and we got a little bit of kind of what they've had to deal with, right? God, I hope I make sense. My voice is dead. I'm
cool local
done
resource
talking.
that maybe craft and or trade? If there's magic, is
My
there a
brain
demand
is
for
tired.
mages in fields like construction? Is their civilization
can't think
secure enough
anymore.
that there's a market for luxuries? And what's the education system like? Does everyone get some kind of basic training, or is there some kind of system of schools? Or is there maybe like a class system that defines your level of education? Who are the teachers? Also, what's the society structured like? Is the power centralized or distributed, and how much mobility is there between social classes? Who's in charge, and how long has that been the case? What religions are present, and how much does that factor into the power structure? This is the part where you can probably do the most playing around. Obviously, there's no real wrong.
And then, of course, if you are a dungeon master watching this, you have to actually in-depth build your cultures. You don't get the luxury that I get as a writer. You'll have to make up stuff on the spot. You have to have your stuff pretty in-depth thought out because your players could end up going wherever the fuck they want. You don't want to railroad your players too much. You want them to be able to explore your world. So you have to have things more thought out than a writer. A writer, we can get away with illusion. We can get away with like the whole iceberg thing. Here's the top of the iceberg. Here's everything below, but you're not going to see that, right? And some of that may not even exist. As long as the illusion is there that you think that there's a deep iceberg, then the writer is doing their job, in my opinion. Of course, I love fucking reading history, but like, will this stuff ever get published? Will I ever publish something like the fucking Silmarillion? Who the fuck knows? As of now, this is just a means of me, for fun, of me detailing a history of a culture that I want to have, where I can then look through here as I'm doing my writing now and then, and I can just pull things out from here and include. Instead of needing to always create something off the top of my head. I can already have something pull from a history. Also, this is like a history of an empire, and because of the way empires work in our real world, colonialism, imperialism, this is the one culture I should have really in-depth built out so that I can be able to then build the illusion of the other cultures with how did the empire twist this culture? How did the empire change the course of this culture's development? That sort of thing. No, God, I have no clue if I'm making sense anymore.
Way to think through your world, but the question of politics, education, religion, and the job market is often very flexible, and you can just kind of go crazy here. The last thing to do is basically drop it into the world and figure out what that does. Who do they trade with? How much travel is there to and from them? What people and professions does it attract and from where? How cool are they with foreigners moving in? If they're a distributed empire like Rome, what other cultures and people have they subsumed, and how will that affect the culture as a whole? Who are their allies and their enemies, and why? Who have they fought wars with? How do they defend themselves? Do they have an army or a bunch of strategic...
Now, also, I do want to add, personally, I do not recommend doing this step by step for, like, because things change, right? As you get better as a writer. It's like, start off with the base culture, and it's like, oh, did this culture become an empire? Okay. Once that culture became an empire, don't really keep, like, how does it interact with the rest of the world here? I don't think you should, like, it's so hard.
Strategically placed mountains or a space laser or what?
I'm
and if
tired.
they do have an army, who's...
This is the longest Trope Talk video, and I thought this would be one of my shorter ones. I didn't think I was going to have anything to say. So my brain, I was not prepared to actually have a lot to say. So my brain, there's no fuel up here anymore. I spent it all. I have nothing else to talk about. I don't know what else to add.
Who trains them, and how long do they typically serve?
I have
And for
things
the
I
icing
want
on
to
the
say,
cake
but
that
I don't
brings
know
us
how to
all full
word them
circle,
anymore.
What does the rest of the world stereotype this civilization as? What oversimplified perceptions define them in the eyes of strangers? What does your world think their hat is? Be warned, this kind of world building is a rabbit hole and a half. I've spent days on end doing this kind of thing, and the research alone can eat up surprisingly large chunks of your time. But conveniently, it's also crazy fun, and tends to give you a lot more story and character ideas than a boring old Planet of Hat.
Exactly. Right. That's one benefit. Let me pull it out. Hold on. Let me pull out. Hold on. I gotta find it. Here it is. So this is a list. You cannot read that. Never mind. I thought it would show up. But this essentially is a piece of paper. You can kind of make out that there are words on it. This essentially is just a list of names of people of the imperial family line, just starting with them, and then eventually I'll branch out and give Nick do this for like other families once I've finished the imperial history. But like we have characters like, this list here gives me like there are a bunch of characters. There's like 20 character names here. And so with nicknames, and it's like, okay, how did they earn these nicknames? I can write a story there. So this in itself, by world building out this history, has given me a means of telling like already like 20 plus different stories on just a single individual character on how they got that name. Whatever.
Hats does. Also, it helps to study a whole bunch of history and or
over
anthropology, since that can...
When was the last time I had a video go over an hour? I think it's been over a year.
Can give you some really cool ideas for how some civilizations have worked in the past in really weird environments. So, yeah.
And that was Trope Talk, Planet of the Haps. Planet of the Haps. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button. I'm hungry. I'm gonna go eat lunch. Oh my, this took an hour. Goodbye.